Hello, today is Wednesday, February 10th, 2021. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. This is part 2 of a 2-part podcast series where we discuss the impact of COVID-19 on enterprises and your ICT spend. Part 1 focused on understanding your network needs in the current COVID-19 and post-COVID-19 worlds. Today, we dive deeper into how to structure your current and future state contract commitments to address the types of risks COVID-19 has shown can occur. I'm again joined by Deb Boehling, a partner at LB3, and my fellow TC2 director, Julie Gardner. Hey, Deb and Julie, thanks for coming back. After hearing about the network changes that you are seeing as a result of COVID-19, and also your tips on how enterprises can manage those changes to save some money, can't wait to learn how to avoid risks related to contractual commitments. So, Deb, as the lawyer, why don't you kick it off?
Thanks, Joe. And I know that contracts are what most people are really excited about, so please take interest. For almost a year, enterprise customers have grappled with how their contracts may protect them in these uncertain COVID times and how to structure contracts to mitigate their risks. The primary contractual business risks are driven by network and usage changes discussed in Part 1. Some business risks are derived from a reduction in usage, which threatens a customer's ability to fulfill revenue and service commitments. Other risks turn on unexpected growth in usage, such as with UC and web conferencing services. We're now going to look at the different types of commitments and reductions to them, underutilization charges, service terms, and early termination charges for telecom services. We will also address strategies for structuring your license and pricing for UC and web conferencing services.
Hey, Julie, I've focused on these outside of the COVID-19 context, but what should enterprise customers expect in their current circumstances?
Well, thanks, Joe. I'll start with commitment structures. So revenue commitments require that enterprise customers purchase a certain amount of services from the underlying vendor. They come in a couple different flavors. Generally speaking, you'll have a term revenue commitment and an annual revenue commitment. Now, term revenue commitments are the recommended approach. They really allow you to best address the ups and downs, changes to your business that may happen over the term of your contract. These are really going to provide you with the most flexibility, especially with the changes that most of our enterprise customers have seen over this past year. Now, annual commitments don't have this same flexibility unless they're super complex, and they typically are going to have a limited percentage of carry forward or carry back of the revenues from one year or another. Now, when you're pressed, most vendors will agree to negotiate a term commitment, and that's really the gold standard that we recommend that our enterprise customers seek to achieve. Now, regardless, your commitment should be no more than 75% of your expected run rate over the measurement period. And if you're talking about a new vendor you're migrating to, then you really need to make sure you structure that commitment so that it provides you with a ramp period or a period of time that you have to transition services over to the new vendor. The best-in-breed term commitment also allows the customer to extend for a year and add to the existing term revenue commitment on a pro rata basis instead of having a separate annual revenue year commitment. Now, this type of approach provided windfall protection for several of our clients this year. So you absolutely need to understand what kind of commitment structure you have in your deal, and you should be getting monthly commitment tracking reports regardless of how often your commitment is measured, either on a term basis or on an annual basis, so you know in advance if you have trouble brewing.
That's right, Julie. And by trouble brewing, you mean finding yourself in a position where your new COVID-19 spend isn't expected to meet the revenue commitment in the contract. Hopefully, your contract contains clauses that allow you to reduce that revenue commitment if certain things happen, such as a business downturn, network changes, or network optimization. The extent to which these help, of course, depends upon the specifics in the clauses. Depending on your type of business, you may have suffered or continue to suffer a business downturn with COVID-19. But that's not enough. The clauses often include conditions. For example, is your business downturn clause limited to events beyond your control? Does closing a location meet this requirement? If not, can you use the network optimization clause in your contract to address this and other activities discussed in Part 1 of our podcast, such as reducing operating hours? You most likely have experienced changes in your networking needs to support work from home that have affected overall usage and usage at particular locations. You want to understand if your contract provides a reduction for that network optimization activity. This can be very different in different contracts. Sometimes it's limited to closing a site and having a documented change that that site has been closed. Other times it requires optimization of the services be with the same vendor. So you have to use the same vendor for a larger or smaller circuit. Or even worse, if you're trying to change technologies to reduce your cost, they often require you to stick with the same vendor and that the new technology cost at least as much as the one being replaced. You will also need to watch out for caps on the amount of the total revenue commitment reductions allowed for all such events.
So, Deb, for all of these changes providing a reduction to the commitments or a waiver of underutilization charges, I think you'll agree that customers, they really should be asking, do I have to notify the vendor of the event? And if so, have I done so in a way that the contract requires?
Yeah, that's right, Joe. If the answer is you have not notified the vendor of these events, you need to do that now. Almost every contract clause that I've seen requires some notice of the event that is causing or the basis for a revenue commitment reduction. Something else you should keep in mind, in existing contracts, you need to gather the facts and analyze them against the conditions to understand the likelihood of your success in getting that commitment reduction. For contracts under negotiation, remove as many specific conditions as possible and negotiate more flexibility in those that are remaining. For example, we talked about notice. You'd want to have a right to do an email notice of the conditions, not the formal notice that is required. And you'd want that notice to be at any time prior to calculation of the underutilization charge, not merely at the time of the event.
Yeah, great points, Deb. And again, if you haven't already done so, you need to make absolutely sure you've documented every significant network change that could result in your shortfall and get the documentation over to your vendor at an interval that matches your contract's notice requirements. In practice, I've done this for many years when I was in industry. It absolutely will save you money, but you cannot wait until the end of your measurement term to say, oh, wait, I'm in shortfall. I've got a problem. You've got to proactively do this over the term of your contract. And given what we know about COVID-19 and the changes that it's had for most of our enterprise users, the time is definitely now if you haven't already started. And as Deb mentioned, the risk of underutilization remains regardless. So seek an appropriate underutilization charge like 50%, but don't pay this right away. Deb's going to tell you more about how to mitigate this type of underutilization charge momentarily.
There are other commitments, right, Julie?
There sure are. There's a few others. We're going to talk about the service term commitment. That really means how long you have to keep a circuit or its equivalent in place. If you fail to do so, you'll pay an early termination charge. This is sometimes, depending on the vendor, also called a minimum payment period, a minimum in-service period. This is different than what is also called a minimum retention period. We're talking about minimum service periods. Now, for these, it's best to apply the service term commitment only to U.S. or international Ethernet access circuits, and to limit them to 12 months from the initial installation. This means that the service period minimum does not reset with a renewal. It is based upon the installation. You should be able to negotiate a right to change your port sizes, upgrades, and downgrades for a port in COS over the term of your contract. You'll be bound there by the underlying access speed. Obviously, you can't go above whatever your underlying access speed is, but you should be able to go up and down. We talked a good bit about that in part 1 and how to use that ability to minimize some of your costs and optimize some of your network costs in the COVID-19 era. You need to check your contract before you start doing those downgrades, though, to make sure you didn't unknowingly agree to those port-specific minimums based on your agreement term. This is super important because oftentimes we'll find clients unknowingly agreed to this. So look in your contract, make sure you've got a 12 months from installation, and that should be for access only. If you do have something for ports, make sure you understand what the language says. It can say 12 months. It can say the longer of 12 months or the agreement term, or it can be 0 months. So make sure you know what that is. Best-in-class MPLS agreements will have no port-specific minimums. Your internet and SD-WAN contracts will have 12-month minimums on the ports that, again, should be from that circuit installation date. Any early termination charges, whether they're on the access that we said you should expect the 12 months on, or on the ports, which may depend based on the port type, should not exceed 100% of the unsatisfied monthly cost remaining for the required in-service period. And none should apply if you have good reason for terminating the service, such as chronic or extended service problems.
And if you find your shortfall after the reductions that Julie mentioned, don't pay the underutilization charge right away. Your contract could provide what we refer to as a work-off period, That's a period of time after the end of the contract term during which you can continue buying the services to make up for the shortfall. Your contract may also let you withhold disputed charges, and you have a dispute. Force majeure clause may provide an excuse for the shortfall. Force majeure clauses typically benefit the party with the most obligations under a contract, and that's usually the vendor. Before COVID-19, enterprise customers, whose primary obligation is to pay for the service, strictly limited what constituted a force majeure event. And that was typically because payment obligations weren't excused or even delayed. Pandemics and epidemics were infrequently listed, but national, state, and local emergencies and government restrictions were. COVID-19 seems to fit these categories, or at least provide a reasonable basis to dispute an underutilization charge. Whether it does, however, will depend on the specific contract language and governing law. For example, New York courts typically construe force majeure clauses strictly, but in a recent case, J.N. Contemporary Art versus Philip Auctioneers, the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York found COVID-19 to be a natural disaster within the force majeure clause and therefore excused performance. Other cases on application of force majeure to COVID-19 are pending, but whether or not a natural disaster is listed in your force majeure clause, this New York case is a positive development. With an existing contract, you need to carefully evaluate the facts and how they address any criteria in your contract's force majeure clause. Notices of force majeure events are typically required and may include the anticipated length of the impact. Make sure you follow these notice requirements carefully. For contracts under negotiations, seek to include natural disasters. For contracts under negotiation, seek to include natural disasters, epidemics, and pandemics as force majeure events. Moreover, since COVID-19 is now a known risk, you need to address it specifically. You should specifically include COVID-19 in the force majeure clause. But in doing so, keep in mind that vendors also benefit from the excuse. For example, if there are critical deadlines in your contract, be sure to make sure COVID-19 is not an excuse for delays in meeting those deadlines. Whether your enterprise is entitled to reduction of the commitment or relief from an underutilization charge depends on the details in your force majeure clause and how your experience relates to it. It may also depend on when you enter into the contract, pre-COVID-19 or during COVID-19. You need to gather your facts. Force majeure only helps with delays or failures to perform, such as to meet your revenue or your service term obligations. It will only allow for termination of affected services, not the whole contract, where it is specifically listed in your force majeure clause. But your force majeure clause is unlikely to help with the COVID-19 induced growth in web conferencing and UC services usage.
So, Julie, how should enterprise customers address this?
Joe, this is a tougher one. And as I said last time, it's an unpleasant surprise for a lot of our customers, especially during COVID. So while transport is contracted similarly by different vendors, licensing structures really vary greatly and they continue to change. There's all kinds of different licensing models, from enterprise-wide or full deployment to a named host model to an active host model. Now, the enterprise-wide license are going to protect our clients against most of the overage charges we talked about in part one, but not all of them. So really, you're going to need to understand what your contract says. First of all, what your deployment model is. Is it full deployment, named host, or active host? And then what license type are you purchasing? That's going to indicate how many users you can have on your call at any one time before those overage charges kick in, as we discussed in part one. So try to negotiate or renegotiate as appropriate to lower your costs based on your actual usage trends that you're seeing in this post-COVID world. If you're unsuccessful in renegotiating, there are some alternatives for you, but start with a benchmark, look to renegotiate, and then look at events that may trigger your rights for reductions based on what your contract says.
All right. Thanks, Julie. And thank you as well, Deb, for these insights and these strategies. Now, COVID-19 has definitely changed things. So if you do have questions about what we've covered on these two podcasts, you can contact Deb, Julie, me, or any of our TC2 and LB3 colleagues by giving us a call or sending us an email. And if you want to stay up to date, you can subscribe to these Staying Connected podcasts. You can check out our websites and you can follow us on LinkedIn.